The 2024 NFL Draft begins tomorrow. How about a trade up for the New York Jets? We'll break down that idea today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, April 24th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangReadNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I'll admit it, I have a competitive side, and it's a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. Well, we're one day away from the start of the NFL Draft, and today we're having a mailbag podcast. Each Wednesday, we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. We begin with a question about the first round of the NFL Draft. John, I know you've expressed an aversion for the Jets to trade up from 10 to try and get a highly rated wide receiver or tackle prospect. But what if the price wasn't that big? Would it really be the end of the world to give up a fourth round pick or two in order to get a prospect like Rome Odunze? And that's a great question. And I think the answer is that these situations are not so black and white. Frequently when you talk about how you operate in the NFL draft, a move may not be all good or all bad. When you talk about some of the prospects that could be available for the New York Jets, I think many of them could be very, very good. Rome Odunze, the wide receiver out of Washington, is clearly among them. I think he's going to be an outstanding receiver in the NFL, and I would be very, very happy if the Jets were able to pick him up tomorrow night. Would it be the end of the world necessarily if the Jets gave up one of their 2 fourth-round picks, or even perhaps both of their fourth-round picks in order to get Odunze? Well, from the standpoint that most fourth-round picks don't make it, no, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. Yes, Odunze would provide outstanding value for the New York Jets. He and Garrett Wilson would stand to be an excellent 1-2 punch at the wide receiver position, potentially for the next 6 to 8 years. You could perhaps make life easier on whatever quarterback the Jets draft to take over for Aaron Rodgers in a year or two. There would be a lot of benefits to getting Rome Odunze. I think the challenge goes back to something I mentioned on the show last week. And there's a difference between tactics and strategy. Trading up, giving up, let's say the Jets trade up to 8, and they make a deal with Atlanta. They give up one, maybe both of their fourth round picks. That's a tactic, and you're getting Rome Odunze, and he'll add a lot of value. Strategy is more about like what you're thinking long term. Yeah, how do all the pieces of the puzzle fit what you're doing when you're talking about the way you're building your team, and that deals with resources that you utilize, how you utilize them. Are you leaving yourself in a position to build a full team? And I think when we're talking about overall strategy, it becomes more and more difficult the more picks you give away to build a successful team. In other sports, in basketball, in the NBA or baseball, you don't necessarily need to draft well to build a great team. Now, that's one way to do it. There have been a lot of great teams that have been built in both those sports through the draft. But there are other avenues at your disposal that you can build a team with if you're not drafting well, or even if you want in the NBA, if you want to trade draft picks, it's a very valid approach to just, it's called like stockpiling assets. And essentially you wait for a star to become available on the market. And then you have so many draft picks, you can overwhelm a team with an offer and get a superstar to onto your team. Also in those sports, it's much more common for like the true franchise changing talent to hit free agency and change teams. LeBron James has changed teams in free agency 3 times throughout his career. Kevin Durant's done it multiple times. In baseball, there have been a lot of star players that have switched teams through the course of their careers in their primes. That doesn't happen so much in the NFL. Part of it is there just aren't that many franchise-changing talents. Football's a game where you have 22 starters versus 9 in baseball or 5 in basketball. So you need more players. The difference one player can make even at the quarterback position, and we're not talking about quarterbacks today, is only so big. The other aspect when we're talking about team building in the NFL is teams have a very valuable tool at their disposal, the franchise tag, that if you do have one of those rare game-changing talents, you can prevent that player from hitting the open market. And that kind of has 2 effects. The first effect is the tangible is that it allows you to prevent the player from hitting the open market. The second is less tangible. Is that every player who's a superstar knows that the franchise tag is hanging over his head. And that means that the only way I'm going to get a long-term deal, the only way I'm going to get one of those kind of deals that will create generational wealth is I need to re-sign with my current team. So there's an incentive to work out a deal before I hit free agency. There's another dynamic in football that I think exists, and that's just the nature of the sport. There are career-altering injuries that happen frequently in this league, far more than in any other sport. I mean, look, every sport there's a risk you could suffer a career-altering injury. It's happened in any league you want to name, but they happen more frequently in football. And I don't think I need to explain the reasons for that are obvious. There's just the nature of the game. So that's another thing that kind of incentivizes you if you're a superstar player to re-sign with your team as soon as possible. Because, yeah, if I'm a basketball player, in theory, maybe I'll suffer some injury that alters my career, but the odds of that are really, really pretty low. It's not something you really have to worry about all that much. Whereas in the NFL, it's maybe the odds aren't that good, but the odds aren't zero that I could suffer a career-altering injury my next game, and that could completely diminish my earning power going forward. So if my team offers me a good deal and it's like 80% of what I want, I'm probably going to take it. So the challenge this creates in the NFL, getting back to our point, is that you really can only build through the draft. It's not in other sports. You can build through the trade market, you can build through free agency. There are lots of different approaches in other sports. In the NFL, you really have to build the core of your team through the draft. It's the only way to get great players, because great players usually don't become available, and if they do, it's because they've suffered one of those career-altering injuries and are trying to bounce back, or they're at the end of their career, and there's risk that there's going to be decline or something like that. And you only get one first-round pick a year. And when you talk about the picks rounds 2, 3, and 4, those can be very valuable picks in the right hands. But most of the players you draft in that range don't pan out. And the value of those picks comes when you add them in bulk. Because, yeah, my odds may not be that great if I only have one third-round pick. But if I have like 3 third-round picks, then I only need to bat like 1 out of 3. I only need to have a 333 batting average in order to succeed in the third round. And the odds aren't super low. The odds aren't great. The odds are below 50% in these rounds, but they're higher than they are in the late rounds, and they're still not bad. If I gave you like a 1 in 3 shot of getting a great player, I mean, yeah, the odds would be against me. And I think that's what people always look at when they talk about trading. Well, there's only a 1 in 3 shot of this guy becoming a good player for your team. So what's the difference? 1 in 3 is pretty valuable. 1 in 3 is not nothing. If I gave you a 1 in 3 shot at a lot of things, you might take it or not take it based on whether you wanted the thing or not. 1 in 3 happens 1 out of every 3 times. So you look at where the Jets are right now. They've given up a lot of these day 2, early day 3 picks over the last couple of years. And, if you want to build your team, it's tough to do that. It's tough to keep giving away these picks. The smart teams are adding these picks. And if we're talking about the Jets sending more of these picks out, look, for a player like Roma Dudze, it would be a situation where there'd be some good and some bad to it. I'm not going to come on the show on Friday and say it's an absolutely disastrous move. But I think you need to acknowledge that there is a cost. And you also need to acknowledge that the Jets picking at 10 right now, they're not picking 200th. At 10, there's still going to be plenty of great players available. So, I think that it would be, I'd lean towards not doing it if that's what the offer was. If they do it, then, so be it. It wouldn't be the first time. I think the Jets are doing something they shouldn't do, and it certainly wouldn't be the worst move, and it certainly would have some redeeming components to it. But I think that, looking at this from the 30,000-foot view, it's not just that they'd be giving up a 4th-round pick here or there. Giving up 1 pick isn't really that big deal in the grand scheme of things. You give up like 1 pick every 5 years, but when you're constantly doing it, when you're constantly sending these premium picks out the door, it becomes much more difficult to build your roster. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about a strategy I recently employed. I actually played the role of Joe Douglas on a mock draft here on the Locked On Podcast Network. I got a question in our mailbag about my approach, and I'll go into more detail about what I was thinking as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. If you're a fan of Locked On Jets, you should know that the Locked On NFL Mock Draft is available now. Find the ultimate 6-episode series on Locked On NFL Draft to hear who the local Locked On experts are picking for each NFL franchise, with live reactions from local college football experts and even the fantasy football angle. The Locked On NFL Mock Draft available now on Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And today on Locked On Jets, we are having our weekly mailbag show, and that's a perfect segue actually to our next mailbag question. It asked me about the Locked On NFL Mock Draft. John, in the Locked On NFL Mock Draft, you went. I'm not going to tell you who I've drafted. You'll have to listen in, but you went for a certain player at 10. I was curious if the mock draft allowed trades and whether you tested the market or whether you did not like your offers and decided that this player was too good of a prospect to pass up on. So, yes, what I just told you about the Locked On NFL mock draft, all of the Locked On hosts played the general manager of their specific teams, and I picked a certain player at 10. So the question is, did I get trade offers? And I want to offer a little context here is that whenever I do one of these, sometimes I do them on my site at SB Nation, where I run the Jets site. Whenever I do one of these mock drafts, I always act the way I think the Jets general manager would act. I don't do what I specifically would do. To answer the question, yes, trades were allowed. And yes, I did get an offer from the Saints general manager to move down a few slots. And I was offered a third round pick in return. I turned that down because I don't think Joe Douglas would take that deal. I think I would have taken that deal if we're talking about what I would have done. I probably would have taken that deal, but I'm trying to simulate what the Jets would do, because I think the idea of a mock draft is you're trying to figure out what your team would do. And I mean, I probably don't need to tell you, the Jets don't do things exactly the way I would do them. The Jets don't really run their franchise the way I would run things. So I would have looked to trade down personally, but my guess, and this is just an educated guess, I don't think the Jets will look to trade down. Or I don't think they'll look to do it aggressively. I think, if we get to a scenario where one of the quarterbacks drops, when some team offers the Jets a king's ransom, some team offers the Jets an offer they just can't refuse, that's just so loaded with premium picks, then I think they'll take it. But my sense is that the Jets are not necessarily of the mindset that their first choice their first option is trading down. My guess is, this is just my prediction, and look, it could be wrong. It's the NFL draft. The NFL draft has a real domino effect where one team doing something unexpected can change everything. The team drafting fourth overall doing something we don't expect, that could have a trickle effect that impacts what happens with the Jets. But I think that it's more likely the Jets are going to trade up than trade down. In fact, if you're asking me what the order of based on the order of likelihood, I'd say the most likely scenario is the Jets staying put at 10, just because it's always more likely you stay put than it is you trade. I think the second most likely scenario would be the one we kind of just laid out in the first segment. Maybe the Jets really, really, really like Roma Dunze, and they decide, we can, if he's there at 8, we'll move up, we'll deal with Atlanta, we'll maybe give up one of the 2 fourth-round picks, if not both of them. I think the least likely scenario is a trade down. It's not impossible, of course, but Joe Douglas has not shown much of a appetite for trading down in the first round anyway, and I don't think he will this year. I think Douglas's focus has really been on the present. So I would be a bit surprised. I'd be pleasantly surprised, because especially when we're talking about trading down, if we're only talking about trading down a couple picks, in reality, I know we hype up some of these prospects over others, but in reality, picking 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, your expected outcomes just about as good as it is at 10, maybe a little bit, maybe a little bit less. But, if you add a day 2 pick, even if it's a third round pick, that could have a great impact for your franchise. Again, going back to what I said, is that once you start stockpiling these picks, rounds 2, 3, 4, maybe even round 5 a little bit, that's when you have a real opportunity, because that's when you're doubling, tripling your chances of finding a good player. And when you find a good player in that range, and there are still good players in that range, you've got, you've really really done something big, because those players don't make much money the first couple of years in the league. So you're getting a good player or a great player at a discount. I would like to see them move down, but I don't know that it's necessarily going to happen. Our next question. I read recently that contracts for interior defensive linemen have increased more than any other position. The article stressed the impact Quinnen Williams and Aaron Donald have when they're on the field, and it's a major reason interior defenders now command premium pay. As I thought about it, the Jets have been relatively injury-free on their defensive line, particularly the interior linemen. Do you think the Jets' strategy of frequently rotating defensive linemen has reduced injuries, particularly interior defensive linemen? Well, I think, the caveat here is always, injuries happen up front and they can happen for, freak reasons. But I think that's part of it. I do think that's part of the strategy, because, one of the things we do know is that when players are more fatigued, they're more likely to get injured. There are a couple of reasons for that. Maybe their technique lapses. There are a lot of reasons for that. So I do think there's something to that. I think a big part of it's just the Jets just want to keep their defensive linemen fresh through the game, because when you're trying to close out a win in the fourth quarter, the other team's got the ball with 2 minutes left. You don't want your defensive linemen, your pass rushers gasping for air. You want them to be fresh. And I think it's clearly a philosophical thing. I mean, there are areas where it doesn't seem like this front office and coaching staff are necessarily on the same page. But when it comes to the defensive linemen, it definitely feels that way. It definitely feels like that's one area where the front office and coaching staff kind of see eye to eye, because Jets have been very aggressive trying to add quality defensive linemen. And the reason for that is that if you're going to rotate guys, you don't want there to be a big drop off between your first tier guys and your second tier guys. If you're going to rotate, that means that, your depth players are going to see more playing time. And that means, you want to make sure you have good guys, because you want to still be able to get after the quarterback when that second wave goes in, and that keeps everybody fresh for the end of the game. But yeah, I think so I think that's the mindset, but I do think it's conceivable that there's a residual effect where maybe it makes your linemen less likely to get injured because they're not playing with fatigue, and again, playing injured is something that increases playing when you're tired. Fatigue is something that increases your odds of getting injured. And I think, part of the benefit the Jets have is that they also have talent in the second and third levels of their defense. So, even if you lost a Quinnen Williams, and I'm not saying you hope you lose a Quinnen Williams, you still could probably weather the storm. I think back to 2022, the Jets played a game in December when Quinnen Williams was injured against the Detroit Lions. And everybody remembers that disaster fourth down play where the Jets gave up the long touchdown to lose the game. But through most of the game up to that point, up for the first 58 minutes of the game, the Jets defense was playing really well without Quinnen Williams. It's not because they didn't miss him, because if you watch that game, the Jets were not controlling the trenches anywhere near at the level they did with Quinnen in the lineup. It was just that the guys in the back of the defense, even though the Jets weren't playing as well up front, were able to kind of weather the storm, because you still had talent on the second and third levels of the defense. So, that's I think that's one of the things that makes it easier to rotate Quinnen out, even though the Jets don't have great depth at the defensive tackle position, even though there's a clear drop off. And, I think that's part of the philosophy, is that the Jets feel like we can stick anybody who's credible next to Quinnen Williams and he'll produce fine. I think these things are all connected in a way. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention past the first round of the NFL draft. We've talked a lot about what the Jets are going to do 10th overall, or if they trade up or trade down. Let's talk about what they might do a little bit later. We'll do that as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Monopoly Go. We've all been there, either as a player or a fan. It's halftime and the scoreboard's not looking good. You're feeling low, not sure if you or your team can pull out a win. That's when you dig deep, you lift up your head and say to yourself, time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heists, and take as much of my friend's money as I possibly can. I'm not talking about real life. I'm talking about the smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go. It lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but on your phone anytime, with tons of new twists, including leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. There's so much to do. You can play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards. You can make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball, and you can charge other players rent for your iconic properties. You can even work with your friends if you want to crack open community chests and in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboard. So get back out there, put your game face on, and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question, John, I think it's pretty safe to say that the Jets will likely be grabbing an offensive lineman or pass catcher in the first round of the draft. How do you think the Jets should approach the draft after the first rounds? Well, assuming they don't trade down. So that's the assumption I'll make. I think, need kind of goes out the window. to a greater extent than people realize. I think that there's a perception that, when the Jets pick in the third round in the early 70s, that if they take a tackle in the first round, then the third round pick is going to be a wide receiver, or if they take a wide receiver in the first round, that the third round pick is going to be a tackle. I'm not so sure about that, because once you get down to the third round of the draft, you're not really talking about dealing with immediate needs. You're really focused more on the longer run. And I'll give you an example of this. So I pulled up data from the last decade, players drafted between 62 and 82. So that's 10 picks in front of the Jets and 10 picks behind the Jets. It gives us a decent data set. And I think there's this perception you draft guys in the third round, they're going to be immediate starters for you. And the reality is a little bit more complex than that. It's possible, but only 15% of players drafted between 62 and 82 in the past 10 years started at least 12 games as rookies. So, that's nothing. That's not nothing. I mean, there are a couple of players every year who end up being starters for your team as rookies drafted in that range, but it's not that many. And we go back to 8 games, so like half the season, talking 8 games. Only 31% of players drafted in this range started half the season. So yeah, I mean, there's a handful of guys every year who maybe start off the season needing a little bit more seasoning, a little bit more development, and they and maybe by the halfway point of the season they're ready to step in, or maybe you have an injury and they need to step in. But it's not as many as you think. Now, again, if you're telling me I have a 1 in 6 shot of getting a full-time starter in the third round, well, where else do you have an opportunity like that on the NFL calendar? 1 in 6 shot of getting a close to minimum wage starter, that's pretty good. A 1 in 3 shot out of getting a minimum wage guy or close to minimum wage guy who's going to start half the games. Again, that's not a bad deal, but it shows you that the expectation for a third round pick really is not to be an immediate starter. It's one of those things where if you get one, you feel very fortunate, but you can't count on it. And I think that, especially because the Jets lack a second round pick this year, people are counting on it. And it's just not the type of thing that happens to the degree that you can say we're getting an immediate starter. Again, if you hit on it, if you find a guy, that's great. But typically there's a reason the third round picks aren't immediate starters. And that's, if the guy was ready to start, if a guy was a finished product, a polished player, he'd probably go in the first or second round. Those are really the ranges where you get guys who can step in and help your team immediately. So I think that all of this means is that the Jets can't be as focused on filling needs in the third round as you think. And that's also true in the fourth round as well. There's a decent chance that the Jets can get a good player or two with these picks, but you may not have the immediate impact you're looking for. It may be maybe a year or two down the line where the guys you draft are able to step into the lineup and really help your team out. So, if the Jets draft, I don't know, defense in the third round, people are going to be really angry about it. But you really have to think of it more in terms of as a long-term investment. You can't think of it in terms of the short-term benefit, because in all likelihood, there's not going to be a short-term benefit. And, if there is, then that's great. And you feel really good about things. But I just don't think it's something you can count on. Next question. If the Jets go pass catcher at 10, are there any mid-round offensive tackles you like? Yeah, so this, with the caveat of what I just said, I don't think you can necessarily go into the draft, saying if we draft a wide receiver or Brock Bowers at 10, then we have to take a tackle at 72. Patrick Paul out of Houston, I think, is an interesting prospect. And when we're talking about drafting tackles in this range, I don't know if third round fits your description of mid-round picks, but I think that's the guy I would have my eye on. I think he brings a lot of intriguing traits to the table. So that might be the guy I'd look to. And it's not to say you can't draft a tackle in the third round or fourth round. In fact, it's not a bad idea. I mean, the core of most good offensive lines is drafted early on, but I think pretty much any good offensive line, you have to find a starter or two in the mid to late rounds and develop them, because you only get one first round pick a year, and the offensive line is not the only spot where you have to build your team. So, while you do have to invest in the early rounds, you also have to hit on some guys in the mid rounds. And that's to say nothing of just the idea of building depth. The offensive line depth is not built in free agency. There's a shortage of quality offensive linemen in this league right now. So by the time anybody's hitting free agency, if they're any good, they're usually getting a starting job. There aren't many quality backups who sign with other teams. Now, every year there's some veteran who's got a lot of starting experience or something like that who signs with another team. And when that guy signs, the fans all go crazy. This guy's great depth. Usually he's not great depth, though. Usually he's not really that helpful. It's just a name that people recognize who started a bunch of games, but isn't really going to play all that well. Depth is really built through the draft, and it can be through those mid-round picks. Hitting in the mid-round isn't just about finding starters, although you got to find a couple starters on day. You got to occasionally find a day 3 starter on a starter on day 3 of the draft, but you also need to hit on those picks just to find depth players, to find quality backups, to find guys who can get you through 3, 4, 5 games if you have a medium-term injury. And I think that's kind of the idea of the Jets drafting a tackle at some point in the mid-rounds this year. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk. It will be draft day. Can't wait.